Internet, and welcome to this my overview video of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, where the British threw out their King James and brought in a Dutch prince called William to be king instead, basically because they didn't feel like having yet another Catholic king on their throne. It is an interesting period because it was basically the final end of absolutism on the British throne, and it also started the sort of British alliances with the Dutch republics and later the Austrian Habsburg that would eventually, through various paths, leaves the British to their dominance of Europe in the late 19th century. But yeah, the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Enjoy! In 1688, James II had been on the throne of Britain for 3 years. He had followed his childless brother Charles II on the throne when Charles died. Charles had been on the throne since the death of Cromwell, who had won the Civil War against their father, well, Charles and James's father, and had him executed back in 1649. Now, Charles had been a bit less careful than his father in claiming divine right of absolutist rule, but he had to a certain degree tried to limit the power of the British Parliament and the British concept of parliamentarianism after the protectorate of the 1650s. However, when I say Charles, by the way, was childless, that's an absolute and utter lie. He had tons of children, he just didn't have any of them with his wife, as was the style of the time. One of them, the Duke of Monmouth, actually tried a rebellion against James as soon as James got on the throne in order to claim the throne. Because, and this is the problem, James was a Catholic, and in the 150, 60 odd years since Henry VIII had created the Anglican Church, a very anti-Catholic sort of overall feeling in England and Great Britain had grown up. There were some very big, shall we say, legends about how awfully horrible the Catholics were, and the English were absolutely not willing to have a Catholic king, or at least not willing to become a Catholic country, and of course they feared that a Catholic king would slowly fill all important positions with other Catholics until the country itself became Catholic. And I have said Catholic way too many times, so let's move on. Now, rumors have swelled about Charles II, or had swelled about Charles II, that he was in fact secretly a Catholic in at least his heart, if not necessarily in public, but he was never dumb enough to actually publicly convert, even if he was. He remained a dedicated member of the Church of England, at least, as I say, in public, though there are some indication he might have been baptized as a Catholic on his deathbed, though at that particular time he seemed to have been delirious enough probably not to realize what the hell was going on. At any rate, the British was certainly not keen on seeing James on the throne. He was a Catholic, people disliked that. He truly believed in absolutism and the divine right of kings to rule, you know, without any sort of real bonds on them. The British certainly didn't like that, both the people and the landed gentry, which had become controlling of a lot of British power since the death of their grandfather, King James, in the 1620s, was absolutely against being ruled by some guy on the throne in absolutist fashion. Also because, of course, this was what was currently happening in France with Louis XIV, the Sun King, and the British had no intention of becoming the slaves to the will of the despot as they saw the French at the given time. However, Catholic or not, James was the legal ruler. And of course, everyone sort of took it as a given that since he didn't either have any sort of legitimized children, the throne would eventually go to one of his daughters, probably the elder daughter Mary, who was married to the Protestant Prince of Orange. I'll get back to the Prince of Orange in a very short time, or perhaps after her, the other Protestant daughter Anne, who was married to the equally Protestant Prince George of Denmark. So people were sort of willing to do a minor opposition of James's more Catholic ideas while trying to maintain just the parliamentary and church hegemony within England and accept the rule of James as it was, and then hope for the better when he was away. Now, in this political landscape, James could probably have gained a lot by proclaiming that yes, he was a Catholic, that was what he believed, but he had no desire to change anything in the British political landscape, and if he then did have, try to do it, quietly and conciliatory. James did not. He decided to try to ram through the repeal of several anti-Catholic laws and measures and appoint Catholics to high positions when some of the high courts decided to strike down several laws and measures that James and his government had wanted implemented in order to, again, repeal some of the anti-Catholic regulations and to just give bigger freedom of religion in England. Well, when that happened, James then decided to replace practically all of the judges with others that he felt would be loyal to him. They were, but it of course did not exactly endear dear old King James to the rest of his populace. Eventually, he decided to have a go at striking down the Test Acts, which was basically a rule that says that people had to, well, not take a test, but have to make an oath that they would respect the supremacy of the Anglican Church and so on before they could hold public office. And he did so in a decree that he then requested was to be read from all churches in his kingdom so everyone would know about it. Now, 7 bishops in England then decided to petition the king to be at least, if he wouldn't withdraw the decree, then at least be exempted from having to read it from their churches. And James, again, having a chance to strike a conciliatory measure, instead decided to arrest them, imprison them within the Tower of London, and put them on trial for sedition. Eventually, all of them, even with James's hand-picked court system, was acquitted to great acclamation in the populace. As you can imagine, at this point, after 2 short years on the throne, James was getting incredibly unpopular, probably even more unpopular than his father had ever been before Cromwell and his Roundhead armies cut his head off. But of course, having just gone through the horrors of a civil war, the British wasn't too keen on having another one. This, then, of course, the fact that, again, James was, he had his daughters, and his daughters would take the throne. Let's just outlive this guy. Let's not have another civil war. Then in early 1688, everything changed. James had a son, a legitimate son, James Francis Stuart, the man who would later become known as the Old Pretender. At this point, James Francis was baptized as a Catholic, and now the situation changed completely, because this, of course, meant that the inheritance was secure from one Catholic monarch to another, and the British high noblemen and gentry became very worried, and something needed to be done. Now, we need to move away from England for a time. In France, Louis XIV, the Sun King, had created a very, very centralized absolutist Catholic, well, it had all been Catholic, but very, very centralized absolutist state in France that was at the time utterly dominant in Europe to a degree that, well, France wouldn't see again until the rise of Napoleon, and practically had never seen before since the reign of Charlemagne. However, one of the things that had happened in France was that about 100 years prior, at the end of the French Wars of Religion, that I will return to eventually, King Henry IV, Louis XIV's grandfather, had promulgated the Edict of Nantes when he became king, which basically said that yes, Catholicism is state religion, but Protestants have certain rights and privileges, and here they are. At this particular point in the early 1680s, Louis had become very secure in his own power and decided to basically renege on this edict. He abolished it and published another thing where basically he said that everyone who's Protestant in France must either convert, leave the goddamn country, or, well, basically be forced to be utterly abused by anyone who is Catholic. It was like he basically promulgated a law saying that anyone who was Protestant would have to have several dragoon soldiers living in their house. These dragoons could do whatever they wanted to the people living there, and the people who lived there had to pay for the whole damn thing. What this meant was that a lot of Protestants left France and went into exile. Others converted, and of course there is debate today about how much this actually weakened France. 200,000 people in a populace of more than 20 million is perhaps not as terrible as it seems. However, it was a lot of very skilled craftsmen and bankers and so on that often went into exile. So while it didn't perhaps weaken France that much, it truly strengthened the nations where they were going. And one of the places they were going was Holland, the Dutch republics, which had finally gained its independence from the Habsburg monarchy about 30 years prior at the Peace of Westphalia. The Dutch republics was theoretically ruled by various local council of elders, but in practice the power in the republic was held by the current stadtholder, or city keeper, as the title basically means, Prince William of Orange, a descendant of the original rebel against Habsburg rule. This William of Orange very quickly became Louis XIV's greatest opponent in Europe, his arch enemy, if you will. And what was important about him was that he was, one, Protestant, so he was seen as sort of the Protestant champion against the Catholic despot in the Protestant lands of Europe, and two, he was married to Mary, as I said, the daughter of King James and the prospective heiress to the English throne until the birth of her younger brother. Now, James of England did not get along well with William, his son-in-law. First of all, James, as the Catholic, had tried to promulgate various alliances with Louis XIV's France. In fact, one of the few times in history that, well, before modern day, that England and France had a alliance going. Secondly, again, William was fairly, well, he was a Protestant. There was the Catholic thing. They didn't get along well. And especially not since James knew that William, through Mary, would of course come to hold a position in power in England should James die. Now, the birth of James's son, as I said, brought things to a point. Eventually, after some waffling, the Parliament in London and several of its higher noblemen decided to extend an invitation to William of Orange to please get up your army, come over, throw out James and become our king. And William, deciding that since he obviously couldn't beat France on his own with only his Dutch and a weak alliance with Austria forces, that he would just be the guy to become King of England and thus utilize its powers in his personal feuds with Louis XIV and with France. So yes, he gathered all of his available forces and set sail in the autumn of 1688, landing in the south of England and proclaiming that he was there, of course, not to throw out James, but to simply ensure the rights and privileges of the English people against a tyrannical despot who had gone a bit too far, i.e. his father-in-law. James, who definitely felt like he was the guy to rule England, and in fact rule it incredibly absolutist, gathered up his armies and went to meet William in battle. However, on his way, he started to lose courage. He didn't feel his troops would be sufficiently loyal. He didn't know if his generals would be good enough. It didn't help that a lot of the noblemen who went with him, including, by the way, his other son-in-law, Prince George of Denmark, and the man John Churchill, who would later become the Duke of Marlborough, also defected to William before the campaign was even started. So instead of having a battle, James eventually disbanded his forces, fled back to London, then escaped England to the, or at least England mainland, to the Isle of Wight, while William marched his forces all around the south of England, getting extra strength and getting extra support from the various gentry there. Since he didn't immediately march on London and didn't really take the throne immediately, James was able to return to London to try to strike a deal with William, but eventually he gave up the game and fled to France, where he was supposed to raise a French army to retrieve his kingdom. Sadly, at this point, William quickly moved to London, and in the name of himself and his wife Mary as co-rulers, took the throne of England for himself, leaving James stuck in France as a house guest, if you will, of Louis XIV. These, of course, led to the Jacobite rebellions of 1690, 1715, and the Bonnie Prince Charlie one in 1745 that finally ended the Stuart dreams of reclaiming the British throne. So basically, without firing a shot, William have achieved the throne of England as well as his government over Holland, and thus achieved all his purposes. And of course, the English had managed to get their Catholic king thrown out, and with William invited in, they were managed to get him to sign a deal that basically established parliamentarianism as the system of government in Britain rather than absolutist rule. Doesn't mean that no shots were fired. William had to fight a prolonged war in Ireland, where James returned with some forces to try to regain his kingdom like that, and also some battles in Scotland, where several of particularly the Highland clans were supporting James at first. However, in the end, within 3 years, William was securely on the throne of England. England was securely a Protestant nation. In fact, a promulgation was established that no person that was Catholic could claim the throne of Britain, which of course eventually then led to the Hanoverian secessions after the death of first William and Mary, and then Mary's sister Anne in 1714. This adding of the British military power, particularly the Expeditionary Corps under the Duke of Marlborough, and of course the incredibly strong naval power of the Royal Navy, also allowed William and the anti-French alliances of Europe to finally create a force that was strong enough to curtail Louis XIV in the two wars, the 9 Years' War, also called the War of the League of Augsburg, and later the War of Spanish Succession. While they could not truly defeat the French, they utterly curtailed them and fought them to standstills, and in fact minor overall victories, and thus defeated the French attempts to become utter hegemonic in Europe and destroy their Protestant enemies as well as their Habsburg enemies in Austria, and through that put Britain on the commercial and military path to the dominance it would receive in Europe following the 7 Years' War of 1760s, and of course the Napoleonic Wars about 100 years later. So yeah, that was the Glorious Revolution, where the British kicked out their Catholic king, established him with a Protestant Dutchman, set themselves on its path to modern day history, and of course led eventually to the legends of Bonnie Prince Charlie. Okay then, that was it. My video about the glorious revolution of 1688, which is, as I said, primarily important because of what it did to the power balance in Europe, and of course finally rendering England into the landed gentry dominated Protestant Anglican country that it would become, and that would develop into the superpower, first sort of real world superpower that it was in the 19th century. Overall, I hope you found this interesting. I might return at least somewhat to the subject again. I have already spoken about the War of Spanish Succession. I might eventually do something about Louis XIV overall. But yeah, I truly hope you enjoyed this. And until next time, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.